Dr. Khambata, and welcome to the Truth About Weight Loss Summit. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Chef AJ. It's always a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, thank you. Dr. Khambata, is there any connection between a person's blood glucose and attaining their ideal body weight?
I'm glad you asked. The answer is absolutely. There's actually a very strong connection between your blood glucose values and many aspects of your metabolic health, including but not limited to weight loss. Number two, your risk for developing prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. Number three, your risk for developing cancer. Number four, your risk for developing heart disease and all of the manifestations of heart disease, including high cholesterol, high blood pressure, atherosclerosis, coronary artery disease, and beyond. So I like to think of your blood glucose control or maintaining ideal blood glucose control as being one of the most important aspects of your overall health, because it's connected to so many different conditions, so many different chronic diseases that are affecting the majority of Americans today. So we can go into a lot of detail about why blood glucose is so important. And most importantly, we can talk about this concept known as insulin resistance, because insulin resistance is really the condition that is most closely related to practically every chronic disease that you can think of.
Wow. I'd love to learn more.
All right, so I can share my screen and we can do a little presentation. How do you feel about that?
That sounds great.
So today we're going to be talking about, how to master diabetes, but also how to just attain ideal blood glucose control. So give you a quick background. This is me. I was diagnosed with not one, not two, but three autoimmune conditions in my senior year of college. So it was the year 2002, and I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's hypothyroidism plus alopecia universalis, which is why, as you can see on the screen, I have no hair, no eyebrows, no eyelashes, no ear hair, no nose hair. I have no chest hair. I have no hair on my body at all. So alopecia is basically just me, a scientific way of just describing complete hair loss. And then I was also diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So I got all three of those in my senior year of college at Stanford University, and my life changed very quickly. So at that time, my doctors told me to eat a low carbohydrate diet because a low carbohydrate diet was at that time and still is today considered the most effective way to keep your blood glucose controlled. And as a result of that, for somebody living with type 1 diabetes, would also be a very effective way to keep my insulin use from continuing to go up over the course of time. So I adopted a low carbohydrate diet like you see on the screen here. And I ate a lot of things like cheese and eggs and red meat and white meat and turkey burgers and butter, under the promise that this would keep my glucose controlled and my insulin use low. But that did not happen. In fact, my blood glucose became so erratic that it felt like my blood glucose meter was a random number generator. And it didn't matter what time of the day it was. It didn't matter how much exercise I did. It didn't matter how much food I ate. It didn't matter how stressed I was or how relaxed I was. My glucose was unpredictable. I had no idea what it was going to be. It was bouncing between dangerously low and dangerously high values multiple times per day. And as a result of that, I became pretty upset. I suffered from low energy. I became mildly depressed, and I knew that I needed to change. So I started looking for more information, and I literally stumbled into this idea of eating a plant-based diet. So at that time I said, you know what, I'll do whatever. It doesn't matter. I just want to feel better. And so I started to eat foods like you see on the screen here. And I worked with a gentleman named Dr. Doug Graham, who went on to write a book called the 80-10-10 diet, which is all about eating a raw food diet in particular. And he showed me how to eat foods like you see on the screen here, lots of fruits, lots of vegetables, and lots of color. And so within a short period of time, you can see that my carbohydrate intake right here shown in green went up from being about approximately 100 grams a day all the way upwards of 600 grams per day. And that happened within a few weeks. And my total fat intake actually came down from being approximately 80 grams per day all the way down to somewhere between 10 and 20 grams. So I was effectively trading carbohydrate for fat and eating more carbohydrate and eating less fat. And what I was worried about was that because I was eating so much carbohydrate energy, that my insulin use would go up and my blood glucose would become out of control, because that's what the doctors had told me. But what ended up happening was the exact opposite. My insulin use actually came down, and it came down dramatically. It came down by 43% in the first 3 weeks. And what was incredible here was that if you kind of graph carbohydrate intake and insulin use together, what you'll find is that they're divergent, meaning as my carbohydrate intake went higher and higher, my insulin use became lower and lower. So the two of these are moving in opposite directions, but that literally went against everything that the diabetes world had told me. It went against everything I read on the internet. It went against what my doctor said. It went against what my nutritionist said. It went against what I saw on YouTube. There was literally only one human being on the planet that could describe what was happening here, and his name was Doug Graham, and that's why I chose to work with him. So I was so excited by what was happening inside of my body, because not only was my insulin use down, not only was my blood glucose more controllable, but I had more energy and I could exercise more, and I felt like $1,000,000. So I decided to enroll in PhD programs around the country. And I ended up going to UC Berkeley to get a PhD in nutritional biochemistry so that I could understand the actual science. And while I was there, I studied insulin resistance inside and out. So we'll talk a lot about what insulin resistance is and why it's important. It's specifically important for weight loss as well. And I went there with one question, which is this. The question I literally had was, am I a freak of nature? Because I'd never heard about this happening to anyone else. I had never read about this happening to anyone else. I thought that maybe I was a genetic anomaly and that this phenomenon of eating more carbohydrate for less insulin was just kind of unique to me. But it turns out that, in fact, what I was experiencing was a very well-described biological phenomenon. And it has happened to thousands and thousands and thousands of people over the course of time. So here I am today. Quick rundown of my stats. I've reduced my insulin use by 40%. I eat a boatload of carbohydrates on a daily basis, more than 700 grams, which, you know, for most people living with any form of diabetes, this is a week's worth of carbohydrate energy or a month. And I do this every 24 hours. I inject approximately 25 units of insulin per day, which is a physiologically normal amount of insulin. And my A1C values are currently between 5.4 and 5.7, which is considered non-diabetic right here. So, you know, I'm a happy camper, and I'm pretty excited that this system has worked not only in my favor, but also helped thousands of people since my time through our coaching program. So, you know, we wrote a book. It's called Mastering Diabetes. This became a New York Times bestseller in the beginning of 2020. And I'm actually going to read you some information from this book directly in this presentation in a little bit, because there's some very important information specifically about calorie density and about how you can use that to your advantage in order to keep your body weight low while eating plenty of food to keep you satiated. And so we're going to be delving into this book to really get a good idea of how this is even possible in the first place. All right. So when it comes to understanding carbohydrate metabolism, this is the thing that a lot of people get confused about. The traditional, you know, diabetes world, or the traditional blood sugar world, if you will, tells you that they say, okay, well, if you eat anything that's carbohydrate rich, like bananas or potatoes or white rice, right? Even refined carbohydrates like cookies and crackers and chips and pastas and sodas, regardless of what type of carbohydrate you eat, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because all of those foods are just going to turn into this stuff called sugar. And then this sugar is going to make your insulin use go up, whether you inject insulin from a vial like me, or whether your insulin comes from your endogenous pancreas, right? So this is the anti-carbohydrate or the low carbohydrate methodology. Carbohydrates lead to sugar. Sugar causes excess insulin production or excess insulin use. So what lots of people do is they go, okay, well, I don't want to stress out my pancreas. I don't want to inject more insulin. So I'm going to have less sugar in my blood. Therefore, I'm going to eliminate carbohydrates or get rid of or lower them to a very low amount. Here's the problem. This is a single variable relationship, which says do less of this and end up with less of this. Okay, here's the problem. If you take a look at biology and you study biochemical pathways and you really delve into biochemistry, what you'll find is that there's no such thing as a single variable relationship in a human being. I literally cannot think of a single variable relationship in all of human biochemistry. It just doesn't exist. And the way that biochemistry is actually organized inside of organisms, inside of all mammals, including humans, is that reactions are grouped into what are called biochemical pathways. And these biochemical pathways are very, very complex. And they involve many different intracellular and extracellular players. They involve nutrients in your blood. They involve cell surface receptors. They involve intracellular proteins. They involve specific enzymes. They involve different organelles. They involve the mitochondria. They involve the nucleus. They involve DNA. They involve RNA. And before you know it, you have a very complex puzzle that has many different players associated with each other. You can think of it as a game of dominoes where you tip one domino and then you end up tipping, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 other dominoes. And some of these dominoes feed back on the original domino and so on and so forth. So they're somewhat circular pathways. And these pathways are organized into a very complex, what looks like a ridiculously complex subway map that says, oh, this little complex over here is also related to this other pathway that's also related to this pathway. And before you know it, you take a look at this collection of pathways and you think, oh my gosh, biochemistry is complicated. There's nothing about the system that's linear. So you can't just say, eat more sugar and all, or eat more carbohydrates and that turns into sugar, because it's just too simplistic and it's just not biologically accurate. So in the world of, diabetes and blood glucose, so this is what people are told over and over and over again, right? They say you can get autoimmune diabetes, either type 1 or 1.5. You can get prediabetes or type 2 diabetes, which is considered lifestyle diabetes, or you can get versions of diabetes or blood glucose imbalance that affect women, which is gestational diabetes that happens during pregnancy, or polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is not a version of diabetes, but involves or results in erratic blood glucose control. All of these types of diabetes are actually related to each other, but the modern medical world does not want to believe that. They do not talk about them and treat them as if they're related conditions. The thing that connects all of them is this thing called insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is actually, like I said earlier, one of the most important concepts in all of biology. And here's the reason. Insulin resistance it touches every single chronic disease that you and I can think of today. So before we get to this slide, I'm actually going to fast forward. This is what insulin resistance does. As your level of insulin resistance grows, not only can you negatively affect and increase your risk for many forms of diabetes, shown in the top right quadrant here, but in addition to that, as insulin resistance becomes more prevalent inside of your body, inside of your liver and inside of your muscle in particular, your risk for cancer can go up. Your risk for coronary artery disease, hypertension, atherosclerosis, and high cholesterol can also go up. Your risk for obesity or weight gain, unwanted weight gain, can also go up. And we're going to delve into this in a lot of detail. Your risk for fatty liver, polycystic ovarian syndrome, and Alzheimer's disease goes up. And also your risk for things like neuropathy, blindness, kidney failure, neuropathy, erectile dysfunction, all of these are exacerbated when insulin resistance becomes a bigger deal inside of your body. So the next logical question is, all right, well, what is this insulin resistance thing you keep talking about, right? The simple way to think about it is that insulin resistance is not caused by carbohydrate intake. That's what most people believe. Insulin resistance is actually caused by the accumulation of excess saturated fat in tissues that are not designed to store large quantities of fat. Okay, one more time. Insulin resistance is caused by the excess accumulation of saturated fat in tissues that are not designed to store large quantities of fat. And we know that this is the case. We know it. This is not my opinion. This is not a theory. This is not a guess. This is fact. And the reason we know that is because there are many scientific papers that have already described this in significant detail. And you can see here that paper after paper after paper in the medical literature clearly connects lipid metabolism, which is fatty acids and fat soluble components in your diet, with, it says here, the pathogenesis of insulin resistance, meaning the creation of insulin resistance. Other papers say how free fatty acids inhibit glucose utilization, inhibit the glucose metabolic pathway. Okay. Other papers say the role of fatty acids in the pathogenesis of insulin resistance and non-insulin dependent diabetes. So it's everywhere. Okay, the mechanism of free fatty acid induced insulin resistance in humans. Like, this is very well described in the medical literature, but yet people don't know this. So if you think about insulin resistance, what you do is you primarily think about two different tissues, your muscle and your liver. Those are the two tissues that are negatively affected and impacted the most. Okay. In addition to that, your pancreas and your brain can also become insulin resistant over the course of time. But for the purposes of this discussion, let's focus on the muscle and the liver, because these are the two tissues that are affected first. And then these are the two tissues that are affected secondly, or secondarily. Okay, now the sequence of events of insulin resistance happen like this. Okay, the first thing that happens is that lipids enter your blood before glucose. So what does that mean? Okay, so suppose you ate a hamburger, or you ate a cheeseburger, actually. The cheeseburger is right up here. This is a fat-rich meal. And the reason it's fat-rich is because it's got red meat. It's also got cheese, and both of those are high in saturated fat. But then in addition to that, it also has some carbohydrate energy that comes from the bun. So we're looking at a meal that is rich in saturated fat and rich in refined carbohydrate. In other words, this meal, which is what a lot of people eat on a daily basis, which is a cornerstone of the standard American diet, is a metabolic disaster. And I'll show you exactly why. Okay, you eat the cheeseburger. These yellow circles are depictions of lipid or fatty acids. Okay, so the saturated fat from the meat and from the cheese basically end up in your small intestine, where they absorbed by these things called microvilli. These microvilli structures basically absorb the fatty acids, and then they transfer them to your lymph system, which then goes into your blood. And this happens relatively quickly, within 15, 20, 30 minutes of eating the cheeseburger. So within a short period of time now, the amount of lipid, or the amount of fat inside of your blood, increases because your digestive system does a good job of absorbing them relatively quickly. Now, when that happens, the lipid actually slows down everything else about the way that your meal is processed. So as that lipid gets inside of your blood, and as it gets inside of your intestine actually slows down the rate at which your stomach empties. And that's important, because the rest, there can be a kind of a temporary traffic jam that's built up inside of your stomach that gives you a sensation of being full. So you may have felt this before, where you eat a fat-rich meal and you don't even have to eat that much. And before you know it, all of a sudden you're like, oh, wow, like I'm pretty full. Like, I don't really want to eat anymore, right? And the thing is that you don't actually have to have a very large amount of material inside of your stomach in order for that to happen, because it's the presence of the saturated fat that's actually causing that signal. So the next thing that happens is that fatty acids enter your liver and your muscle. So inside of your blood, these fatty acids, they're using your blood as a highway, as a conduit to get to tissues. And two of the tissues that they get to include your liver and your muscle. So these fatty acids end up making their way inside of your liver and making their way inside of your muscle. Now, your liver and muscle have the ability to absorb fatty acids from your blood. They have the mechanism to be able to do it, except both your liver and muscle are only designed to store small amounts of these fatty acids. But when you have a saturated fat rich meal, or you have a lot of saturated fat in your diet in particular on a daily basis, whether it's breakfast, lunch, dinner, you do it again tomorrow, the next day, if there's just a lot of fat in your diet, then without knowing it, you end up storing an excess quantity inside of your liver and muscle, which kind of overwhelms their physiological design. So in this scenario, the presence of these fatty acid molecules inside of your liver and muscle actually slow down the action of insulin. They inhibit the action of insulin. And so as a result of that, when insulin tries to say, hey, knock, knock, muscle, knock, knock, liver, there's some glucose in the blood, do you want to take it up? Both of those tissues respond by saying, yeah, no, I can't pay attention to you right now. And the reason is because these fatty acids actually are causing a break, and they're slowing down the ability of insulin to get glucose inside of your blood. So you saw earlier in the cheeseburger, that there was carbohydrate inside of the bun. So whether there was carbohydrate inside of the bun, or whether you happen to just eat a single banana to come along with the meal, or whether you ate a banana a few hours afterwards, a small amount of carbohydrate can result in an overaccumulation or a traffic jam of glucose pooling inside of your blood as a result of that, because this glucose is trying to get inside of your liver and muscle, but it can't do it very effectively because the fatty acids effectively beat it there, and they caused a traffic jam, and they inhibited the ability of insulin to get glucose out of your blood. So as a result of this, you now are in a situation where you ate a saturated fat rich meal, and that fat rich meal is now causing alterations to the way that you would normally absorb glucose. So your pancreas basically gets involved and says, okay, well, whatever, I can solve this problem. Let me just make more insulin. So that's what it does. It just creates more insulin. It puts more insulin inside of your blood. And then this insulin is designed to overpower the liver and muscle to try and force this glucose inside of both of those tissues. And it works. But the problem is that in this state, this is called insulin resistance, classic insulin resistance, where there's excess lipid inside of your blood called hyperlipidemia. Then the hyperlipidemia causes excess glucose called hyperglycemia. And then the excess glucose causes extra insulin, which is called hyperinsulinemia. So hyperlipidemia, hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia. 1, 2, 3 at the same time. That's the problem. Okay, so this is why eating the standard American diet that is both fat rich and carbohydrate rich at the same time causes a metabolic traffic jam. It causes multiple metabolic traffic jams at the same time. Now, another thing to pay attention to is inside of your adipose tissue, which is your fat tissue, there can also be another traffic jam that is caused over the course of time. And the way that this traffic jam happens is as simple. This happens mainly in people who are overweight and people who are obese. So you eat a fat-rich diet and fatty acids end up going inside of your adipose tissue because that's where they're supposed to be deposited. And they end up inside of your adipose tissue, but they also get inside of your liver and muscle like we just talked about. So these fatty acids end up going inside of your adipose tissue grows just a little bit. And that means that you start to gain a little bit of weight. And then you eat some more fat. And then now these adipose tissue cells get just a little bit bigger. And all of a sudden now the cells inside of the adipose tissue are just a little bit larger and the adipose tissue mass has now grown. And this continues over the course of time. So now the adipose tissue says, wait a minute, hold on. Every cell inside of me is getting larger because I'm storing more cargo, if you will. And that cargo basically starts to cause the entire tissue to grow. Now, at a certain point, your adipose tissue can actually have cells that break open. And when this happens, these cells become what's called, this state that you're looking at right here is called hyperplasia, which means basically excess accumulation. It's the swelling of the fatty acid cells. So you have adipocyte hyperplasia, in other words, fatty acid cells or fat cells that are getting too large. And then when they overaccumulate fatty acids, they break open and they end up spilling the contents of the inside of the cell into the extracellular material. And this is a huge problem because you have what's normally supposed to be intracellular material now becomes extracellular material. And that's not good. In this situation, your adipose tissue starts to become inflamed immediately. So your adipose tissue actually starts to secrete these things called cytokines. And these cytokines you can think of them as like a 911 emergency phone call. So your adipose tissue literally starts to manufacture these cytokines and send them out into the blood. That's basically like, hold on. We got an emergency. Come fix this right now. So these cytokines basically pick up the phone and they basically call your immune system and they're like, hey, we got a problem over here. We need some help. And the person that they call or the cell type that they're calling is actually called macrophages. So they say, hey, macrophages, can you get over here now? Because we got some stuff inside of the tissue fluid that's not supposed to be here. So these macrophages come to the rescue. You can think of these macrophages as being like, biological Pac-Man, if you will, or they're ambulances, they're fire trucks. And they come and they go, oh, okay, look, we see there's like extra material in here. We got to get rid of this stuff. So these macrophages literally eat the material that's inside of the extracellular fluid. And so this problem, what this is called right here, is called macrophage infiltration. Okay, it's called adipose tissue macrophage infiltration. And that is what this causes is an inflammatory state inside of your adipose tissue. And this inflammatory state inside of your adipose tissue is very problematic because as soon as this happens, now insulin can't even communicate with this tissue anymore because this tissue is now de facto insulin resistant. So your liver is insulin resistant, your muscles insulin resistant, your adipose tissue is insulin resistant, your adipose tissue is now leaking contents into the blood, it's inflamed. Now you have a system-wide problem. Okay. So this has been very well described in the literature. You see it all over the place. Adipose tissue insulin resistance is just everywhere. And this is a very important concept that I think most people don't really fully understand. So I'm going to stop the screen share here because that's the last part of this equation that I wanted to show. When it comes to understanding what to eat, we also want to think about, what is it that you could do as an individual to try and prevent this actual process from unfolding in your body, right?
It's incredible, though, no matter how much you teach this, Dr. Khambatta, people still believe that carbohydrate is the villain.
Yeah, I understand why. I mean, the messaging about, carbophobia, it's strong. You go onto YouTube, you go onto Google, everywhere you go, people are saying carbs are bad for you. Don't eat carbs. Carbs turn into sugar. And like, the truth is that there are two sort of fundamental classes of carbohydrate. There's refined carbohydrate that comes from manufactured products, cookies, crackers, chips, pastas, sodas, waffles, pastries, sugar sweetened beverages. Like, that stuff is napalm. Don't eat that stuff, right? That is the stuff that can absolutely set into motion a whole collection of metabolic problems, including diabetes. There's no question about that. We know this. But there's also a class of carbohydrate called whole carbohydrate rich foods that come from whole foods, such as fruits and starchy vegetables and legumes and whole grains. And when you eat those foods, those are the foods that actually help you lose weight and actually reverse insulin resistance and reverse metabolic dysfunction. So you can see on the screen here that the foods in the green light category, these foods are carbohydrate rich, and that's okay. In fact, there's purposefully carbohydrate rich because it's a fuel that your liver and muscle and brain require in order to operate. So what the sort of cornerstone of this entire approach here that's been documented in over 100 years of evidence-based research is that the more of these foods that you can eat, the better your metabolic health is going to be, and the easier it's going to be for you to attain your ideal body weight. Okay, so we haven't really talked too much about body weight yet, but I'm going to go into that in 1 second here. These are the green light foods, as you see on the screen here. The yellow light foods are the foods that are just like a little bit higher in their fat content. I'm not saying don't eat these foods. I'm saying just pay attention to how much you eat and try and minimize your intake of these foods, okay? Nuts, seeds, avocados, coconuts, olives, these are all fat-rich, plant-based foods, right? And again, you can eat these foods. I'm not saying you can't, but a little bit goes a long way. We also put pastas and breads in this category because they tend to be a little bit more refined, even though they're not necessarily as bad as many of the foods that are in the red light category. The foods in the red light category are the foods that are saturated fat rich, like we talked about. Dairy, eggs, red and white meat, fish and shellfish, oils. It doesn't matter what type of oil, whether it's canola oil or vegetable oil. It could be the most virgin olive oil. It could be coconut oil, MCT oil. It doesn't matter. All of those oils are saturated fat rich. And then in addition to that, refined sugars and pastries and breads fall into this category. So all we're suggesting is to migrate away from the red towards the yellow and towards the green. If you can literally just execute that, you are likely to find a dramatic improvement in your overall metabolic health. You are likely to reverse any pre-existing chronic disease that you currently have, and you are likely to lose weight and keep that weight off permanently, just like you've done, Chef AJ, right? Just like thousands of other people have done, but just like is possible because you've actually done it in your own life. Is that right?
Well, absolutely, because what you're showing is the foods that happen to improve insulin sensitivity are also the foods lowest in caloric density.
Yeah, exactly right. You nailed it. There's no question about that. So on the caloric density side of things, let's talk about that because this can be sort of a confusing topic that I think a lot of people don't fully grasp. And it's really important to understand what calorie density really means because it's the one tool that will enable you to truly eat more food and weigh less. Okay, so before we go into this, one thing that I want to say here is that the weight loss industry has worked a number on, people for the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Okay. The weight loss industry has brainwashed all of us to believe that in order to lose weight, you have to eat less food. In order to lose weight, you have to go on to Weight Watchers. In order to lose weight, you have to count your points. In order to lose weight, you have to go buy these tiny little Tupperware containers and fill your food into the Tupperware containers and eat absolutely no more of this, no more than that. In order to lose weight, you got to eat these little tiny granola bars, and you have to pretend like they're satiating and that they taste great. And then that's the only way to actually lose weight. Okay, here's the thing. That system works. It does work. If you do Weight Watchers, maybe some of you have done this before, you'll probably lose weight. If you calorie restrict yourself, you'll probably lose weight, right? But that I'm not refuting that. What I'm suggesting and what Chef AJ is suggesting here is that that's not a recipe for sustainability. That's not how you lose weight and keep the weight off and achieve your ideal body weight permanently, right? That's what you do if you're trying to fit into a wedding dress and you find that you're 30 pounds overweight and you only have 2 months to lose it. Okay. That's what you do when you want to have that, you want to be able to go to the beach in the middle of the summer and knock off 15 pounds because you haven't been paying attention to your health for the last 6 months. Okay. That's not what you do if you actually want to create a healthful approach that's going to dramatically improve your overall health into the future permanently. So if you want to do that instead, which I'm a huge fan of, obviously, we got a better solution. Here's how I'd recommend doing this. All right. What's the best way to describe this? Okay. We have basically 3 different categories of foods as we talked about earlier. We got the green light, the yellow light, and the red light foods. Now, the green light foods what you see here in parentheses next to, or the number that you see next to the food is the number of calories per pound. Okay. So if you had a pound of that food, you could expect to get about 60 calories out of a pound of butter lettuce. You can get about 150 calories out of a pound of broccoli. You get about 400 calories out of a pound of bananas, 410 out of sweet potatoes, and so on and so forth. Okay. So if you take a look at the foods in this category, you'll basically see that the calories per pound, the number is relatively low. It's somewhere between, I don't know, call it 50 and 600. Okay. That's about in that ballpark. Now, if you go to the yellow light category, these numbers just get a little bit bigger. Okay. These numbers range from, for brown rice pasta, 550, and then it can go all the way up to 730 for avocados, 1,000 for dates, 1,100 for gluten-free bread, so on and so forth. Okay. So nuts and seeds tend to be pretty high on the scale. And these numbers in general, if we had to take an average of these numbers, the average would probably be, let's go down here. The average is going to be somewhere right here in the 1,500 category. Okay. When it comes to the red light foods are by far the most calorie dense. You had a pound of shrimp, that's equal to 540 calories. You have a pound of salmon, that's 830 calories. You have a pound of olive oil, that's 4,000 calories. You got a pound of Oreos, that's 2,140 calories. Okay. So these numbers are much higher than they are over here. So again, what I told you earlier is that we're trying to migrate away from the red light foods and move towards the yellow and then more towards the green. It just so turns out that when you do that, you will dramatically improve your blood glucose control. You will reverse insulin resistance, and both of those are phenomenal because it'll help you reverse many chronic diseases. But in addition to that, you actually eat less calories without knowing it. And that's the mind-blowing trick, if you will. You're not trying to eat less calories. I'm not trying to make you starve. I'm not trying to make you feel hungry all the time. In fact, I'm trying to do the opposite. I'm trying to teach you how you can eat the foods in the green light category. And not only are you likely to enjoy them, but you're actually likely to stay very full a lot of the time, right? There's this common misconception that if you eat a more plant-based diet that you're going to get hungrier, okay? And that's only true if you're eating meals like lettuce and tomatoes and carrots. But if you're eating, hearty, thick soups and stews and potatoes and whole grains and bean dishes, trust me, you're not going to feel hungry all the time. So here's a simple way to think about it. Calories per pound right here shown on the x-axis. The green light foods, they're very condensed. It's very low calorie density. Yellow light foods tend to have a wider range, and the red light foods tend to have the biggest range. And they're the ones that have the highest calorie density of the three different categories. All right. So if we scroll down, I'm reading you passages from the Mastering Diabetes book right here. This is what I want to sort of drive home right now, which is that if you wanted to eat a meal and you came to me and you said, hey, I want to feel full, Cyrus. I want to eat a meal and I want to feel full. Okay. I'm going to give you an option. I'm going to say, all right, you can do one of two things. Okay. You can either have 3.5 tablespoons of olive oil and you can have that as your meal, or I can give you 1 serving of a hearty sweet potato and squash soup, and the recipe is later in the book, right? It's your choice. Which one are you going to take? Chef AJ, if I gave you a choice, which one of these would you take?
The soup.
The soup. Why wouldn't you take the olive oil?
Because there's no volume. There's no way I'm going to feel full. And first of all, I think it would taste terrible, but also that's just such a small amount of food.
Exactly right. Yep. Even if you liked oil and even if you thought that olive oil was your favorite food on the planet, 3.5 tablespoons wouldn't really change your hunger. You're going to drink that. It's going to go inside of your stomach. And then within 3 minutes, you're going to be like, what else is there? I'm still hungry, right? So the beauty here is that you can get the same number of calories from this 3.5 tablespoons of olive oil as if you were to eat a much larger bowl of soup containing green light ingredients, like we talked about earlier. And these green light ingredients and this volume of food is likely to help you stay fuller for a longer period of time. Same number of calories, literally the exact same number of calories, but this one keeps you fuller for a longer period of time. Do that. Next one, Oreos versus cantaloupe. Okay, both of these contain approximately 110 calories. You can have 2 Oreos, right? That's not going to keep you full. You're going to eat 2 Oreos and you're going to be hungry in about 2 minutes. Or you can eat 2 cups of cubed cantaloupe, right? You might still be hungry after eating that. That's fine. But this is a lot more volume and it's likely to keep you fuller for a longer period of time. So that's a good thing. Okay, here's another option. What if I were to give you an option of eating either 3 tablespoons of peanut butter? Trust me, that would probably be very tasty. Or 1 large baked potato. Okay, which one of those would you take?
I was going to laugh and say, I'll put the peanut butter on the baked potato.
That's tempting, isn't it? Okay, so
Baked potato, though, for sure.
The baked potato, exactly right. So both of these, again, they contain approximately 110 calories. So the point here is that the baked potato is going to keep you fuller for a longer period of time because there's literally more mass, there's more volume, there's more material that gets inside of your digestive system. And then the last comparison here is either a half a cup of dried apricots. You can see here a very small amount, or you can eat 9 entire whole apricots. Which one are you going to take?
I'm going to take the one with more.
The one with more, right? Because again, our goal is to eat food and feel full, or feel somewhat full, feel satiated. And you can do that by eating foods that actually have a higher volume. And again, these are green light foods. They will help reverse chronic diseases, and they will help you take on less calories while being full at the same time.
So I agree with you. Let me just say one thing, and this is what I hear from people all the time, because anytime somebody comes to me with any level of diabetes or insulin sensitivity, I say, check out Mastering Diabetes. They go, well, anytime I eat carbohydrates, even the whole complex one, like the beans, the sweet potatoes, they say my blood sugar goes up. I can't eat those.
100%. Yeah. So the reason that happens actually is because if you have already developed insulin resistance via the standard American diet, via a ketogenic diet, via a low carbohydrate diet, if you already have pre-existing insulin resistance and then you just try and add carbohydrate energy on top of that, good luck. Your glucose is going to go through the roof. And I mean, I've proved that to myself about 1,000 times over the past 20 years. Okay. If I'm insulin resistant for whatever reason, like let's say I just had too much peanut butter one day, or, I ate a bunch of nuts and seeds, and then the next day I try and eat some bananas or try and eat some fruit. Good luck. My glucose is going to go way, way, way higher than I want it to go. Right. And that's because what you're doing is you're taking the foundation of insulin resistance and you're literally just adding carbohydrate to the top. Okay, what I'm suggesting is that you take the foundation of insulin resistance that's caused by saturated fat rich foods and you displace. You don't add, you displace. So what you have to do is you have to take that combination of foods that's saturated fat rich and you have to eat less of them while increasing your carbohydrate intake. Okay, so when you do it that way, you're having less dietary fat and you're increasing your carbohydrate intake to make up for the fat-rich meals that you're no longer eating. Okay, so what we tell people is like, hey, listen, I don't want you to make a dietary transition in 3 days. I don't. I have no vested interest in you making very quick moves in a very short period of time. Okay, if you're trying to win a contest, go for it. But if you're trying to actually establish optimal health, I would rather it takes you 3 months to transition your diet, at least, if not more. Okay. And so if you adopt that mindset, then what you say is, okay, fine. If I'm going to transition my diet and it's going to be, slower, then the way I'm going to achieve it is by reducing my saturated fat intake and my total fat intake over the course of weeks. Okay. First, I'm going to change my breakfast and only my breakfast, and that's it. So I'm going to reduce my fat intake at breakfast and then substitute it with things like fruits and potatoes, right? Or, a bean casserole, whatever you want to eat. Then the next week, I would recommend decreasing your fat intake a little bit more by reducing your fat intake at lunch, and then eat a little bit more carbohydrate at lunch. And then the next week you would do dinner and eat a little bit more dinner. And over the course of time, you end up displacing the fat for the carbohydrate. And when you do it that way, your glucose becomes much more stable.
Great. That's important that people know this.
For sure.
Dr. Khambatta, excess weight and insulin sensitivity often go hand in hand? And if they do, does losing weight improve people's insulin sensitivity?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So it's interesting. If you look into scientific research, what you would assume is you would say, okay, the more weight you have on your body, in other words, the more excess weight you have, or the closer you are to being obese, you would assume that every single person who gains weight and or becomes obese would also be insulin resistant based off of what we talked about. And that if you were to lose weight, that you would increase or reverse insulin resistance, right? And the truth is that, yes, there's a strong relationship between the two of those. The more weight you have on your body, the more insulin resistant you become. The less weight you have on your body, the less insulin resistant you are. It's just not a one-for-one relationship. So there's a whole cohort of the population. There's I think it's some number of 40% of all people who are obese are insulin sensitive. And you'd be like, wait, what? How's that possible? Right? You have 50 extra pounds on your body, but yet your glucose metabolism isn't that affected, right? And part of the reason for that is because there's a whole bunch of genetic, there's 1,000 reasons why people who are obese can actually maintain their insulin sensitivity. And a lot of it has to do with where the fat is stored. If it's stored inside of your visceral depot, inside of your abdomen, then the chances are you're going to become insulin resistant. If that fat is stored elsewhere in your subcutaneous depots, then the chances are you're going to become more insulin sensitive. But so my point is that the two of them are related to each other, but you can be obese and insulin sensitive, or vice versa. You can be insulin sensitive and obese. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think Dr. Furman, who's one of the other experts on this summit, talked about visceral fat and subcutaneous fat. So I'm wondering, does that have something to do with the diabetes risk, where the fat is stored?
Absolutely. Yeah. The more visceral fat you contain. So the term visceral, it's one of those weird scientific words, right? Visceral comes from viscera. Viscera refers to your digestive organs. Okay. Your organs that are in your abdomen. So we're talking about your stomach, your large intestine, your small intestine, your spleen, your kidney, your liver, everything that's right here in your abdomen. Okay. Your viscera. If you have fat that's surrounding those tissues, you can talk about it as visceral fat, or you can talk about it as abdominal fat. That is a dangerous place to keep excess fat. That is a very dangerous place, because the more fat that you keep in your viscera or surrounding your viscera, the higher your risk for many metabolic diseases, for many metabolic conditions, including diabetes, including cancer, including heart disease. Okay, so you don't want excess fat to be stored inside of your visceral depot. What you would prefer is for that fat to be stored elsewhere, You get it out of that depot. Just put it elsewhere on my body. Where is that elsewhere? Well, that elsewhere could be in your butt. It could be in your quadriceps or surrounding your quadricep muscle. It could be literally in your shoulders. It could be right here in your tricep. It could be sort of, surrounding. It could be up in your chest. That's okay. So if you were to take the same, call it like 30 pounds of excess fat that's inside of your viscera, and you were to just sort of take pieces off and say, okay, you get stored over here, you get stored over here, you get stored over here, and just displace it in other places, your risk for chronic disease would actually go down dramatically. So the location definitely matters. And you want to try and get rid of as much visceral fat as possible, because that's the stuff that's actually most closely related to chronic disease.
If somebody's not overweight, though, how do they know how much visceral fat they have?
Okay, so if you're not overweight and you want to know how much visceral fat you have, I think the way to do it would be to do a DEXA scan, right? So you can go to your doctor, you say, hey, I want to get a DEXA scan, and they usually use that for like bone mineral density and beyond. You literally lie on a table, it kind of looks like an MRI, it scans over you, and it gives you a result. You can also do another scan called an in-body scan, which is like a scale that you can, sometimes they have it at your gym or the YMCA, and you stand on it and you put your hands on it, and then it puts a electrical current through your body, and it can basically tell you how much fat and how much muscle you have in your left arm versus your right arm versus your right leg, and so on and so forth. So that could also be another helpful way to determine where, how much fat you have stored in particular regions inside of your body.
Because the people that I've met that weren't overweight, that were diagnosed with diabetes, were like, they were shocked. Like, how could I have diabetes? I'm not overweight.
Yeah, exactly right. And, going back to what we were saying earlier, there's many different forms of diabetes. There's type 1, 1.5, prediabetes, type 2, gestational. And there's a lot of people who are not overweight. In other words, they are, they're at their ideal body weight. Some people are even underweight and they develop diabetes. And those people, a lot of those people actually are living with an autoimmune version of diabetes called type 1.5. You can think of it as basically being adult onset type 1 diabetes. And it's sort of a very misunderstood form of diabetes that most medical professionals are not educated about. Again, yeah, it relates to the fact that, your normal weight, you don't have excess body weight, but yet your blood glucose is hard to control.
How long does it take for insulin resistance to develop, and how long does it take for insulin resistance to have negative consequences?
Oh, that's a good question. Insulin resistance can develop, the beginnings of insulin resistance can develop within an hour. Literally, you can go and eat a fat-rich meal right now, and you will display the symptomology of having insulin resistance within an hour. And the reason for that is because, like we showed earlier, those saturated fat molecules are going to get inside of your blood, and then they're going to cause a traffic jam, which can increase your blood glucose values, and then that can increase your blood insulin values. So all of that physiology can be seen if you know exactly how to measure it within hours of eating a single meal, right? If you continue doing that for breakfast today, and then maybe dinner tomorrow, and then, a couple of meals the next day, and so on and so forth, and your overall fat content in your diet is high, then what that means is that you can, your level of insulin resistance is likely to grow, and it's likely to become chronic. And when you develop chronic insulin resistance, that's when you end up increasing your risk for many forms of chronic disease, including, like we talked about, all of the versions of cardiovascular disease and cancer and beyond. To answer your question about how long does it take to cause problems? Well, it's variable. The human body is a master, an absolute master of masking the symptoms of metabolic dysfunction. So in an ideal world, if I had to redesign humans, one of the things that I would do is that every time you eat a fat-rich meal, I would make it painful. I would literally make it painful. I would make it such that you would eat that food, and then it would travel down your esophagus, against inside of your stomach, and like, boom, all of a sudden you would start to feel physical pain, because that physical pain would stop you in your tracks, and you'd be like, wait a minute. Why am I feeling this? Maybe I shouldn't do what I just did, right? But that doesn't happen for most people. What ends up happening is that you eat a fat-rich meal today, you eat more animal products the next day, you eat some dairy, you eat some refined carbohydrate, and you continue to do that for days, weeks, months, years, decades. And over the course of time, metabolic dysfunction and diseases can manifest themselves and demonstrate and show many years down the road. Some of the research here also demonstrates that people who develop prediabetes have had elevated blood glucose for up to 5 years before their blood glucose even becomes slightly elevated. So just think about that. Your liver, your muscle, your pancreas are literally just getting insulted day after day, meal after meal for 5 years before it becomes detectable at the doctor's office, right? So human body is amazing. Don't destroy it. It's your best friend.
I've heard people mention that insulin is a fat storage hormone, or it's responsible for driving fat into the cells. If that's true, how does it work with diabetes?
Okay. So the truth is that insulin is a fat storage hormone, right? But that's not its primary job. Okay. Insulin is a fat storage hormone, but more prominently, and its actual biological design is that insulin is a glucose storing hormone. Let me back up. Is a glucose delivering hormone. It's a glucose uptake hormone. That is its primary responsibility. And so the blogosphere and people on Instagram and people on YouTube like to refer to insulin as your fat storage hormone because it's a convenient scapegoat, and it's a simple thing that they believe is the true answer. But the truth is that insulin is actually more effective at storing glucose, way more effective at promoting glucose uptake than it is at promoting fat uptake. Okay. So the point is that what we are trying to avoid, what you are trying to avoid, and what is ideal for optimal metabolic health is to operate in an ecosystem where the amount of insulin inside of your blood is low. You do not want very much insulin floating in your blood. You do not want it. You don't want it in the fasting state. You don't want it in the post-meal state. You don't want it chronically. You don't want it in the middle of the night. You don't want it while you're exercising. You don't want it while you're taking a shower. You want the amount of insulin inside of your blood to remain low as possible, as much as possible, because that is what is associated with ideal metabolic health over the course of time. When you end up secreting excess insulin because you're forcing your pancreas to work in overdrive, and when you force your pancreas to do that day in and day out for days, weeks, months, and years, that's when you end up increasing your risk for heart disease. That's when your vasculature starts to accumulate a lot of damage. That's when you end up causing problems inside of your brain, and your brain starts to migrate towards more cognitive decline over the course of time. All right. So the idea here is that, yeah, insulin can store fat. It's not its primary job. Insulin can store fat. It is not its primary job. Insulin's primary job is to get glucose out of your blood. And if you think about it from that respect, and if you understand the biology, then what you will realize is that when you become insulin sensitive, very small amounts of insulin can transport very large quantities of glucose. Just like you heard in my personal story, which is just one of thousands and thousands of stories. I ate more carbohydrate energy for less for less insulin, right? I six-tupled my carbohydrate intake, and I decreased my insulin use by 40%. The only way you can describe that is because when you make insulin powerful, a small amount of insulin can do a lot of work, and that's what you're looking for.
That is so great. But many doctors will tell you, at least where type 2 diabetes is concerned, it's you have to manage it for the rest of their life. Is there any evidence that type 2 could be reversed?
Yes, absolutely. Type 2 is a very reversible condition. There's no research that basically says, type 2 diabetes is reversible in this percentage of all cases. But if I had to hazard a guess based off of all the reading I've done and all the work that I've done, I would hazard a guess to say that approximately 80 to 85% of all cases of type 2 diabetes are fully reversible using the strategies that we mentioned here. The other 15 to 20% of all diabetes cases that are not reversible, of type 2 that's not reversible, is related to people's pancreases basically being burned out, if you will. They've worked too hard over the longer period of time, and as a result of that, they just cannot manufacture a sufficient amount of insulin anymore. So for people that are being told that you're going to live with diabetes the rest of your life, if you are being told that, I would recommend you not considering that to be a factual statement. Instead, you have the opportunity to attempt to reverse insulin resistance and reverse diabetes in your body. And only once you've given it a true shot, the exact way that we describe and the exact way that the medical literature has described for over 100 years, and that doesn't work, then you can come to that conclusion. But until you've tried it, until you've dramatically dropped your fat intake and migrated over towards a plant-strong diet, that is a erroneous conclusion without enough information.
Yeah. What's your take on the glycemic index for people that have diabetes, especially those that are trying to lose weight?
Okay, the glycemic index can be helpful, can certainly be helpful, but we're not a huge fan of it because there's actually many foods that are high on the glycemic index, like watermelon and pineapple, as an example, and even things like grapes. They all tend to be sort of like watery, juicy fruits that get a bad rap. And it turns out that those foods are actually insulin sensitizing foods, and they can actually help improve your overall metabolic health. But if you're eating above the glycemic index, then you won't eat those foods ever. Okay, the glycemic index prioritizes foods that have a slow release of glucose into your blood, and usually that coincides with either having a higher protein or higher fat content. Okay, so if you eat by the glycemic index, then as a de facto, you're probably going to be eating more protein and more fat, and that's probably going to make you more insulin resistant. So instead of doing that, what I would recommend is I would say, don't worry about the glycemic index at the beginning. Eat carbohydrate-rich foods, whether they come from fruits or starchy vegetables or legumes or whole grains. I don't care. Mix them as much as you want, do whatever fancy combinations you want, and come up with delicious tasting recipes. And when you do that and you decrease your total saturated fat content and your overall fat content, you're likely to see a significant improvement in your blood glucose and your body weight simultaneously.
Traditionally, when you talk about low-carb diets, they're animal-based diets, but I hear of people now doing a vegan or a plant-based version of a ketogenic diet. Could that be useful for somebody with diabetes or who wants to lose weight?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. The ketogenic diet does not necessarily only pertain to eating animal-based foods. You can definitely eat a plant-based ketogenic diet by eating things like avocados, nuts, seeds, coconuts, olives, and having that be the sort of primary calories that you're eating on a daily basis. So if you were to do that, you would likely keep your blood glucose very low. Your blood glucose might get nice and flat. If you're injecting insulin, you might reduce your insulin use a lot. You could probably lose a lot of weight doing that as well. But the problem is that what you're doing is you're trading carbohydrate again and you're increasing your level of insulin resistance. Again, at all costs, we want to limit the amount of insulin resistance that accumulates inside of your liver and muscle. So no matter how you slice it, whether you're eating fat from animals or whether you're eating fat from plants, okay, too much is going to increase and exacerbate insulin resistance. And too much of that can cause metabolic dysfunction to your arteries and to your kidneys and to your brain over the course of time. Okay, so am I saying that eating a plant-based ketogenic diet is going to cause Alzheimer's disease? No. Am I saying that it's going to cause, stage 4 chronic kidney disease? No, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that there's nothing that you can gain from eating a plant-based ketogenic diet that you can't also gain from eating a low-fat plant-based whole food diet. Okay, you're going to gain zero advantages from eating a ketogenic diet than you would from eating a low-fat plant-based whole food diet. And the beauty is that when you eat a low-fat plant-based whole food diet, you will also gain insulin sensitivity, and that is associated with a dramatic improvement in your overall metabolic health.
And lose weight if you want to as well.
And plenty of weight loss.
So if I understand you correctly, for improved insulin sensitivity, a low-fat whole food plant-based diet is better than one that is low in carb.
100%. There's no question about it. You've been listening. Very good.
I actually have been taking notes. Thank you.
So
my grandmother in the 1960s was called a diabetic. There wasn't a number because it was onset of adults and onset of children. And it was, which is now type 1, but now they call it type 2 because children are getting what is an adult disease. So how do we protect our children from this?
Yeah, it's a great question. So you can protect your children from this in many different ways. Your children basically will mimic whatever you do for the most part, right? If you are a model and you show your kids how you take care of your ideal health, and you get them involved in the kitchen, and you get them shopping for food with you at the grocery store and going to the farmer's market, and really educate them about what specific foods do, they're going to take an interest, and they're probably going to mimic exactly what you do. So if you go to the grocery store with them, as an example, and you buy a bunch of potatoes and you buy some garbanzo beans, and you go to the fruit section and you get a bunch of fruits and vegetables, and then they see that pattern over and over and over again, and they recognize that you're not going to the dairy section, you're not buying cheese, you're not buying chicken, you're not buying red meat, then, well, guess what? They're probably going to ask you 1,000 questions. You can answer those questions to the best of your ability. But over the course of time, when they start grocery shopping for themselves without you, they're going to do the exact same thing. And they're going to go buy fruits and vegetables and beans and legumes and whole grains. They're not going to go to the dairy section. They're not going to go buy some meat, right? Because you've set an example for them, and you've given them the true gift of health from a young age. And as a result of that, they're just going to continue in that behavioral pattern, most likely, and they're going to have exceptional health as a result.
That's great. Thank you. So a lot of the experts on this summit have talked about exercise, how it's not really all that important for weight loss. It becomes more important for weight management. But with somebody with diabetes or insulin sensitivity, exercise is also pretty important, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's a double-edged sword, because the answer is yes. Exercise is phenomenal. Like I exercise every single day. I love it. It's like one of my addictions in life. And there's actually a chapter in our book all about exercise that teaches you the sort of like insulin sensitivity benefits of exercising. The main question becomes, is exercise required? Is exercise required to gain insulin sensitivity? And the answer is no. Okay. So in other words, if you told me, you're like, hey, Cyrus, I'm not gonna move my body for 3 months because I'm doing an experiment. I'm not gonna move my body for 3 months because I broke my elbow and I can't. And I'd be like, okay, well, if you simply just eat a low-fat, plant-based whole food diet, you're going to become healthier. You're going to gain insulin sensitivity. You're going to get better control over your blood glucose, despite the fact that you can't move your body. Okay. The gold standard would be to eat a low-fat, plant-based whole food diet and move your body on a daily basis. If you can do the two of those, then you have two insulin sensitizing mechanisms that are working on each other and that are adding to your overall insulin sensitivity. But if you can't exercise, it's not the end of the world, right? Now, there's a whole collection of people with diabetes that do the exact opposite, and they exercise all the time, but they eat a high-fat diet, or they exercise all the time and they eat a low-carb diet. And those people get frustrated over the course of time because they can't control their body weight. Their blood glucose is still very hard to control. Their insulin use is still very high. And they go, oh, I thought exercise was supposed to help. And my answer is exercise does help. But you're basically exercising, and then every time you open your mouth, you're negating the effects of the exercise that you just did, right? So stop doing something good and then causing insulin resistance at the same time. Stop sensitizing yourself and then becoming more resistant, right? I want you to sensitize yourself through exercise and then sensitize yourself through diet, and do the two of those all day long, every single day. And when you do it that way, your health becomes very noticeably improved.
And you have the keys to the kingdom, as they say.
There you go. That's right.
You've mentioned several times a low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet. And I think a lot of people understand by now that oil is not on the menu. It's very, very high in fat, the highest fat, highest calorie food there is. But where do nuts, seeds, and avocado fit in for both losing weight and reversing insulin resistance? Is it a certain percentage that you recommend?
Yeah. Okay. So the simplest way to think about it is I'm not the food police, and I'm not going to sit there and tell you that you're eating too much avocado or that you can't have those nuts and seeds. Like, none of that. The simplest way to think about it is that we recommend consuming approximately 15% of your total calories as fat. Okay. Approximately 15. It could be as low as 10, somewhere 10 to 15 range. So the way that you would figure that out is you would use a diet tracking app that's all over the App Store. We use this thing called Chronometer. Just download that app, start using it, and start logging all the food that you're eating, and just do that for 5 days in a row. Every day, the app will basically tell you approximately how much fat you're eating. And it'll report back to you, say, hey, Chef AJ, did you know that on Tuesday, your total fat intake was 24%? hey, Chef AJ, did you know that on Wednesday, your total fat intake was 29%? And you would look at those numbers and be like, oh, it looks like I'm eating too much of this stuff. Where is it coming from? And it'll also tell you that, right? So if you log your food for 5 days, then you can basically try and target a total fat intake of approximately 15%, as low as 10% at the baseline. And then if you are in that range, then all of a sudden, boom, now you have dramatically improved your insulin sensitivity de facto. And if you can try and integrate as many plants as possible, then you're likely to also feel the effects, feel more energy, and hopefully start to lose a little bit of weight if you are overweight as well.
Great. So Dr. Khambata, what's the real truth about weight loss?
The real truth about weight loss is that it's actually not that hard. It's actually not that hard. If you just eat according to science and not according to marketing, you are likely to get incredible results. Try and put the internet away and try and follow evidence. When you do it that way, you're likely to lose weight and keep it off and feel fantastic.
I love it. Eat according to science, not according to marketing. Thank you so much, Dr. Khambata.
Thank you, Chef AJ. It's always a pleasure. Really appreciate it.